So, hello and welcome to our fourth and final author talk for the Anti-Racist Community Engagement Principles and Practices book. I'm Nicole Springer, Chief Equity Officer and Senior Director of Professional Development and Scholarship for Campus Compact, and I'm thrilled to have you all with us today. Campus Compact has long been committed to issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as part of our work in the community and civic engagement space in higher education. Over the years, that has taken on a variety of forms, from our Newman Civic Engagement Fellows to our Engaged Scholars Initiative to supporting the authors and editors of this tremendous book. One final note before we get to the main event, and I want to make sure we get there quickly, is I want to make sure that you all know that we will be collecting any resources shared today and then provide them for you in a follow-up email next week. So without further ado, I will hand this session over to John Reif to get the talk underway.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you all for coming today. It's a delight to be here with you to share a portion of this book, Anti-Racist Community Engagement, Principles and Practices. And if I can get my screen to advance, there it goes. You'll hear from three of us today. I will talk for a few minutes to provide the context for the book, how we came to write it, to edit it, to put it together, and a little bit about what the structure and content is. And then I will turn it over to the two authors of one of the chapters, and they will introduce themselves at that point, and then they will tell you about the work they did together with some other folks, and then the chapter they wrote that explains that work. So a little bit about the context for this book. The book has 8 editors, has 64 authors in 22 chapters. And it all started when the group of us who became the editors got together to do a grant focused on diversifying the faculty and creating pathways toward equity. This was a grant funded by the Massachusetts Department of Higher Education, where I work as Director of Civic Learning and Engagement. As we got to the end of that grant, we said, let's do another proposal that really focuses on how folks work with students and how we might support folks in building on the cultural wealth of minoritized students, and do anti-racist, community-engaged programming, pedagogies, and practices. So these ARCE, anti-racist community engagement principles, as we began to develop these principles, we had 2 big questions. What are the impacts of the current way we do community engagement? What are the impacts specifically on minoritized students, students of color, Indigenous students, first-gen students, and Pell Grant recipients? And how can faculty who teach community-engaged courses be educated to resist using deficit perspectives and use asset-based perspectives that draw on the cultural wealth of minoritized students? So there was a group of us from 4 Massachusetts University campuses, plus me from the Department of Higher Ed. We worked over 7 months in teams, studied the literature that seemed relevant. We asked these 4 campuses, how do they understand and respond to the needs and experiences of their minoritized students? And we got very different answers from the 4 campuses. Then we hosted focus groups with students, asking them about their experience in community-engaged courses so that we could draw from their experience a set of principles for good practice. We came up with a bunch of principles. We took those principles to focus groups with community partners. We ended up with 21 principles, and we said, that's way too many. So we boiled them down to 4 big principles, and this is a layout of the principles, and all 21 of those show up as elements of these 4 big principles. These 4 principles then formed the structure for a book that we proposed and that Campus Compact agreed to publish. And there were 8 of us, 4 of us BIPOC, 4 of us white. So we said, we've got 4 principles, there are 8 of us, let's divide into pairs and co-edit each of those 4 sections, one focused on each principle. And the section that I co-edited is Principle 4, a compassionate, reflective classroom, creating a sense of belonging in the classroom by acknowledging student contributions and meeting students where they are. And each chapter, each of the 22 chapters in the book, is structured in basically the same way. There are 3 parts. There's a case. The authors tell us the story of something they did. Then there's a set of practices. The authors tell us, in order to do what we did, here are the main practices that we followed. And they describe those practices. And then the third section is connections the authors draw to change in terms of pedagogy, in terms of curriculum, in terms of the institution where they're located, and in terms of the community that they belong to. The goal in doing it this way was to make it easy for readers like you all to scan through and find stuff that would be relevant to you, and then you can draw that out. And through these examples, we can see more clearly what anti-racist practice might look like. So that's the overview. I'm going to step out of the picture now, and we're going to turn to 2 of our authors who will introduce themselves, and they will tell you about the work they did.
Hello, I'm Maurice Poe. I'm a graduating senior at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and I'm studying psychology and English. And Deborah, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, my name is Deborah Kaish. I am a senior lecturer in the Office of Civic Engagement and Service Learning, and I'm the director of a 2-year undergraduate program that supports students to do the work of social change. That's called the Community Scholars Program.
Yeah, and I was a student in the Community Scholars Program for 2 years. I completed the program last year, and while in the program, not a part of the program, but related to the program, Deborah invited me to just participate in co-authoring and a lot of other stuff in it. But that kind of led to this chapter that we produced, which is called Doing the Work, making space for undergraduate students to participate in anti-racist community engagement. And like John said, it was in part 4 of the overall publication. So yeah, you can go to the next slide. Just to give you an outline of what we'll talk about today. First, we're just going to go over some background and context for the chapter, which, like John described, the case section. Then we're going to talk about the practice, what we did, which essentially led to a community conversation series, which we'll get into later. Third, we'll talk about the connections, which is what we are taking away, and think that you guys should probably take away as well. And then we'll have probably a majority of the time for a Q&A, which should be pretty exciting. And before that, if you go to the next slide, we're just going to acknowledge the other people who couldn't be with us on the Zoom today, but who really contributed and helped with the chapter publication, versus another student whose name is Carlia Dawson. Okay, I knew I was going to screw up the names. Carlia. Wait, do you want to say Deborah?
Dulcinea.
Dulcinea. She's a UMass undergraduate student. She graduated, I think, 2 years ago or last year. Yeah, but she's a co-convener and facilitator. Next is Linda Way Sabeko, who's an associate professor of nutrition at UMass. So they were a part of the co-authoring of the chapter. And then during the community conversation series itself, the co-conveners and facilitators were Vanessa Martinez, who is, I think, is she the director or member of the Women of
On the board.
she's on the board of the Women of Color Health Equity Collective. And the other community partner that we had during the conversation series was Marissa Peasy, who is a part of the Collective Power of Abortion Rights Fund of Western Massachusetts. Yeah, so they were really fundamental in that, and we just want to acknowledge them and thank them for their work. And I will pass it off to Deborah now to talk about the case.
Great. I think I have the next slide, please. So basically, John described the overview of the grant, and just to clarify kind of who was involved where, Linda Way Sabeko and I were on the faculty team at UMass, along with Joseph Kretinsky and Chandra Westrum as part of the grant itself. And then, and we were the ones who helped to facilitate the focus groups. So as John also said, the focus groups were done both with community partners and also with students at UMass who were involved in community-based learning. And at UMass, they were all through classes that were part of the Office of Community Engagement and Service Learning, CECL. And we had lots of significant findings from this focus groups. But something that really surprised us was that many of the students, despite being immersed in social justice classes and being active in community work, didn't feel like they were actually doing the work of anti-racism. And so that was on our mind when we entered another phase of the grant, which was the creation of what we called a community conversation series that would bring together students and community partners to talk about anti-racism in this work. And so at that point, two of the students from the focus groups, we invited two of them, Maurice Poe and Carlia Dulcinea, to join the planning group for that community conversation series. And there were also the two community partners on that team, Vanessa and Marissa. So this chapter emerged from that particular finding of the focus group, but also the desire to highlight the arc of Maurice and Carlia's experience from that initial focus group all the way throughout the planning and then the facilitation of the conversation series. And so we're going to really focus in on that community conversation series because that's what we wrote about. Maurice, before we go forward, can you share a bit about that feeling about how you felt like you weren't doing the work of anti-racism?
Yeah, so yeah, as Deborah mentioned before, I was a part of the focus group, and I think it was probably either my late freshman year or sophomore year. I think I want to say it was late freshman year. But I think a lot of, for me, during that time, yes, I could have been like a underclassman, like freshman or sophomore year. I'm a senior now. So a lot of the things might have changed, but I think at that time, I felt like there's a lot associated with doing the work. For example, like with civic engagement, I think a lot of me at the time was thinking that like doing the work might look like organizing like some sort of big like protest or um like spur people to do something. So even at the time, like when Deborah invited, I think me into the space to like just participate in a conversation, I felt like that wasn't significant, quote unquote, work, but I still felt qualified because just like, yeah, I can talk with people because I like talking with people, but it didn't feel like it was like significant work at the time. Um, so I think in a way that kind of led me to say yes to doing the work, and then I guess longitudinally, like in the long term, seeing how like that little ask and the yes to that ask kind of contributed to a lot of larger work. Um, in the future, I think was a really cool little nugget that I was able to get at the time. But yeah, I think due to that feeling like I didn't think conversation would have that much significance at the time was the ways in which I thought that that wasn't doing the work. And I think the other part, which also contributed to my feeling like I wasn't doing the work, was a lot of my upbringing. I grew up in a predominantly white town. So I think even initially, when I was invited to participate in the focus group, I felt like my experience as like a Black individual wasn't justified or like legitimate enough to like participate in doing the work. So that was also kind of a lot of confusion and stuff, feeling like, oh, do I have the authority to like engage in this work and like stuff like that? But still, again, like being invited and then welcomed, and yeah, just like um spurred, I think, along in the process was another little nugget that I think happened in the whole beginning phases. But yeah, those are like my initial thoughts. And I don't know, should we just keep moving?
Yeah, we can talk about the practice.
Awesome. So I'll just talk about the practice. So yeah, after participating in the focus groups and doing all of the prep stuff, I guess I would call it, Deborah essentially invited me and Carlia to participate in kind of a more planning phase at the time for something that we originally called an anti-racist day of service. So it was basically this team is Deborah, Carlia, me, Linda Way, and oh wait, no, me, Vanessa, and Marissa at that time, both of our community organizers. And we were essentially planning what are we going to do to like create an event to facilitate anti-racist practices and stuff like that. So originally we actually had this idea of doing an anti-racist day of service, but after dialogue and conversation, we thought one day of focusing on anti-racism wasn't like sufficient enough. So we eventually developed this three-part series, which we titled the Community Conversation Series. And to start, like the series goals that we came up with were one, to come to a common understanding of key concepts of white supremacy and healing justice. Two, engage in dialogue about how to disrupt white supremacy culture and make spaces for healing justice in campus community relationships. And three, create a concrete plan for deepening and sustaining this work. So those were our goals, and that essentially led to the community conversation series, which you can go to the next slide, which looked like 3 meetings. I'll go over the first meeting first, which essentially was a 2-hour Zoom gathering where students and their community partners came together in pairs to participate in activities and conversations about healing justice and white supremacy. And I think we have some slides to kind of go over some of the stuff that happened within that first meeting. So if you go to the next slide, we had like focus group icebreakers. I don't know if you want to add in here as well, Deborah. But we like started with the icebreaker question. Um, I don't know if you want to say anything else here.
Yeah, so we're just gonna, as we talk about each session, we'll show a little bit of what we did in that session. And so we had some initial icebreakers before we got into the meat of the session, where we had a Padlet up and everyone kind of answered, and we talked about what people's answers were to these 2 questions. But you can go to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit more about white supremacy culture. And if people aren't familiar with Tema Okun, this is a particular approach to thinking about institutional culture and spaces in which tenets of white supremacy show up in our work. And it's a really fantastic interactive website. And so we use this website during session 1. And you can go to the next slide. Here's some examples. These are just a few examples of how she talks about different aspects and tenets of white supremacy cultures, such as fear or perfectionism or the binary of either or, and how that shows up in our institutions. And there's many more tenets than that. And so we worked with the participants in that first session to think through these aspects and tenets and how they showed up in their own workplaces.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that really quickly, I think something that was really beneficial, especially like with that activity, and I think we talked about this during the conversation series, was the really cool aspect was a lot of the people who participated in the series reported that like the conversations like centered around white supremacy culture, and like even a lot of these tenets weren't being had before. So it was like kind of a very beneficial like conversation where it's just like, wow, I didn't really think like perfectionism was like a tenet of white supremacy, but also like internally, but also like externally having the conversations like with your peers and stuff as well was also something that was like very beneficial. And I think even today, like I think one of the pillars is like a sense of urgency, and I think that's like something that I'm still like trying to wrestle with today, where it's just like you always just feel like on the like I got to get to the next thing, to the next thing. But yeah, so if you haven't like checked out that website, I really recommend to do it. But yeah, and then I think the next part is healing justice. If you wanted to talk about that really quick, Deb.
So, healing justice is a framework that identifies how we can holistically respond to and intervene on intergenerational trauma and violence, and to bring collective practices that can impact and transform the consequences of oppression on our collective bodies, hearts, and minds. And Marissa Peasy, who is with the organization Collective Power and co-president of the Abortion Rights Fund of Western Mass, has experienced a lot of expertise in healing justice, and she facilitates groups and really centers this practice. So she shared kind of what the framework of healing justice was. And then with the next slide, you'll see that we went into two separate groups to talk about how people were thinking about how to disrupt white supremacy and make spaces for healing justice. And that's another Padlet we had going on. And we had two groups at that point, right, Maurice? I think.
Yeah, hard to remember. But yeah, I think we had two groups.
You can go to the next slide too. We were just showing how we were sharing the Padlet, and people were able to respond in that way during the session.
So yeah, I think both sessions were really beneficial in that first meeting. So then I think it was a week we took until we got to our second meeting. So we basically had a week long to kind of just allow everything to like fester and sit in. And then our second meeting occurred, and it was another Zoom format where we had a 2-hour Zoom gathering where we again brought both together the students and the community organizers. But instead of having everyone in one group this time, we essentially had the students and community partners split up separately and engage in reflective work, and then return to share as a whole group. So basically, that was Vanessa and Marissa leading the community organizing group, and then me and Carlia led the student group. And we continued the dialogue and reflected on a lot of the stuff that happened throughout the week that we were thinking about regarding white supremacy culture and healing justice. And we reflected and then shared out at the end. So I think there's also some slides to showcase what occurred in that meeting as well.
Yeah, we took all of what everyone contributed during session one and themed it and brought that to session two to each group. So each group could kind of reflect more on what their own contributions and the other group members' contributions were to that discussion. So we started there. And then we also just wanted to show you this. You can go to the next slide. When this is just some of examples of the student group. So do you want to talk about this, Maurice, about what you posed to the students in this student group?
Yeah, so basically, we did this activity where we essentially kind of reflected and talked about this idea of like, what do I have already to like do the work? And like, what do we need still to like do the work? So on the left, I think are the responses of a lot of students who really actually were able to like see in themselves like the things that already were existing. So like for me, as I kind of like mentioned before, coming from this positionality where it's feeling like I don't have a lot of stuff, and like not really considering seeing like what is already there is something that you don't really think about a lot. So even just I think you can see especially like in the first box where it's like this person wrote a lot of stuff in that first box, and then in the second box, like it's not as much, like time is like needed. And a lot of people agreed with time is a big detriment to doing the work, feeling like there isn't a lot of time, which I think is related to what I was talking about before with the sense of urgency and stuff. Um, but yeah, it was a really, I think, great just spot to be in where we could just reflect and then I think work with peers to discuss like, hey, there's a lot of stuff that we have. There's a lot of stuff that maybe someone has that I don't have, but can be an asset to me. And then like again, reflecting on, okay, what are the common like themes that are either preventing us from doing stuff, which again, I mentioned again, like time shows up a lot, I think, in this. And then again, thinking about, okay, now that we know this, how do we work with that and through that and stuff like that. So yeah.
One thing I think we may have forgot to mention is that when we invited folks, students and representatives from community organizations, they were matched. So it was a student and the community rep was the person they were placed with for their community engagement work in our programs. And so they had an existing relationship. And there was time in our sessions too. We had the student group, the community org group, but then there was time for those pairs, the student and their community org rep, to also, we put them into Zoom rooms to reflect and wrestle with all of these things that were pertinent to their specific workplace and institution.
Yeah. And I think even in those pairings as well, like those conversations were also like some of the first times that people were talking about those things as well. Um, yes. So I think, are we good? Next slide.
Yeah, so this this was a very well-intentioned third meeting that did not end up happening. I just think it got rained out or something, and then we didn't schedule it again. It was during the time when we were all still meeting outside because of COVID. So we had intended to have this in-person social gathering, and maybe we should still try to do that to continue the conversation where we could actually be with each other rather than with each other's Zoom representations, but you can go to the next slide.
Yeah, so I guess that brings us to the connection part. So as John mentioned, like the big takeaway that we're bringing um, from the work that we did. So basically, we worked to disrupt white supremacy culture throughout our collaboration in the following ways. By one, as I mentioned before, initially we were thinking about doing a one-day drop-in event. We rejected that, and I think by doing that, we showed that anti-racism isn't just a one-day event, but this is a collaborative thing that should constantly be thought of and not just deemed to one day. Another way is by prioritizing process, horizontalism, and compassion within the planning team, group dynamics, and conversations. I can remember to this day, I think during the planning conversations and the meetings, it was very like surreal, I think, for me as a sophomore, because I'm like, this just like feels like a community where like people are laughing. We had our meetings, I think, early in the mornings, and like people would be, yeah, 8 a.m. and people would be talking about like, I think, I don't know if Marissa talked about donut dip one time, and I was like, what's happening? But it was just like very personal and yeah, like relationship and familial, where it made doing the work essentially enjoyable and like, oh wow, like I just sit down and talk with these people like for hours if I could. um and yeah, I think that really was a conduit to continuing the work. And then kind of related, in the third bullet, through the powerful and sustained conversations that emerged in the event itself, and the growth and learning that resulted for both students and community members. So it's like this continued um, conversation and ways in which like students and community members can engage and bring the conversations with them. So yeah, even in that last paragraph, the more that faculty, students, and community members work together to create space where there seemingly is none, the more normalized it will become, and the more we can enact the shifts required for anti-racist dialogue and action. So I think to like summarize that paragraph, a lot of I think what was successful about the work that we did was really the connection component and the collaboration component where I don't know if it's counterintuitive, but the way that in which almost making it seem like doing the work was almost deceptive, I think for me. I think is the best way I can describe it, where it's just like, as I mentioned before, feeling unqualified or like I couldn't do something, but at the same time, like Deborah essentially calling on me to say like you know you are qualified and we want you to be a part of this team, and like being in a space and even though feeling inadequate sometimes, people being like, oh no, you do belong here and we do want to hear your voice, versus another instance where it's like if I'm in a space and oh like my voice doesn't want to be heard, or like oh like you don't know enough and all this stuff. I think in this space, and like even I think the fact that I'm here today just shows that like yes, like through collaboration, connection, like students being empowered, they can continue to do the work, and yeah, significant ways, although they might look small, they stack up to a lot of big things in the future. Um,
I'll just add to, and Maurice, you can say if this is accurate, but I remember what I heard, especially from you and Carlia, after everything was complete was this, and I think this is what we meant by horizontalism, is that Marissa and Vanessa are extremely skilled at they were very skilled at approaching their work with the students as equals in that space. And so, and I think so at one point, Carlia and Marissa facilitated a group, and at one point, Maurice and Vanessa facilitated a group, and they were really, they were colleagues in that space in terms of structuring, creating kind of the ideas and facilitation. And so I remember that you and Carlia saying that was really, that was felt like your voice was really being heard with them in particular.
yeah, I definitely, I think you put it perfectly there. Yeah, because I feel like I don't know if it's rare for students to even like be put in a position where it's like I am essentially your equal, but oftentimes I think even they went further where it's just like, oh no, like you are even your voice is more important than mine, which I think is completely, I don't know, rare in the system that we're in right now. And I think even to kind of even further kind of talk about this, um, I'm a senior now, and I think probably maybe some people are like thinking about like connections even further, um, where it's this like community conversation series occurred like 2 years ago during my sophomore year, and the community organization that I was engaged with, and still am engaged with at the time, was youth urban agricultural organization, where it's like I'm working with high schoolers, and we're gardening in the inner city of Springfield, Massachusetts. And even to have an experience like this where I felt unqualified or didn't necessarily feel like I was doing the work, being able to bring the skills that people showed me, where it's like, oh no, like you are qualified and you can do this, I think really kind of informed and allowed me to also bring that stuff to my community organization in Springfield, where it's like working with youth who also don't necessarily understand the full capacity of the significance of the work that they're doing. So yeah, even to like think about the long-term effects, where it's like when someone when one student gets empowered, like they are very capable of empowering and motivating other people who I think I would say have high potential, is the way that I would say it. So yeah, I think I just wanted to add that too. Um, So I don't know if there's anything else.
The one thing, there's a couple of kind of final thoughts. Maybe I have some, and then Maurice, you can, if you have anything to add. I think it's important to talk about doing this work within the confines of the university, in all the ways the university is actually structurally opposed to this work. And it's really, it's challenging for all the obvious reasons. Many of them, the cultural processes and structures of the university that show up on that white supremacy culture chart, which are kind of opposed to the need for this work to be really deep and sustained. And that is difficult given the chronology of the university semester, as we know, versus the year-round work that community orgs are doing. It requires ongoing relationships, so someone has to be holding those relationships as students are coming in and out, and just the time that it requires. We spent months developing this community conversation series, and scheduling those Zooms. I think that 8 a.m. slot was the only time we were all free. We had it at 8 a.m. because it was so difficult to schedule all of us, right? Like, so we're all in this grind in academia, all of us, students and faculty, and also in these community orgs where people are just working so hard. And so I feel like just us spending that time, and as Maurice said, it was really lovely time in the end, was disruptive of kind of these cultural norms that we all have in our own institutions. And so I think for me, it's hard, but it's not impossible is kind of what I took away. We can make that space. And we shouldn't have to do it at 8 a.m. We can kind of continue to try to make space and slow things down. And I think that that is something that really needs to happen if we're going to do this kind of deep and sustained work. We have to disrupt the kind of notion of grind culture for sure, and just slow things down. So that's what I would say. Final thoughts. I don't know, Maurice, if you have any.
Yeah, so I think like in regards to the final thoughts, like if you're gonna take anything away from this, I think my big final thought was the whole just idea of not discounting sometimes doing the little things. Like as we mentioned earlier, and probably like you can probably see all throughout, like a conversation goes a long way. Whether it's just like, oh, I'm going to sit down and I want anti-racism to like be on the forefront of this conversation. And just doing that like at little points, or whether that's choosing just to, because I guess I could have said no to the conversation series, but I still probably would have had all these thoughts in my head where it's like, why did she choose or even invite me to do that? Where it's like, what is different about me? Where it's like, that's a small thing that can go a really long way in the future. But I think for me, like just do the small things because they can lead to big things. I think probably like sitting on this Zoom call and listening to us is probably one of those small things, and then just like going to the next steps in whatever capacity that looks like is super significant. So that's my probably big takeaway. And I guess, are we gonna do questions now? If
Yeah,
anyone
we
has.
have next slide. We have, yep, we're finished.
Okay, and it's my role to invite questions. And so I want to invite you all to put questions into the chat, and I will be looking at the chat and pulling them out. And because I'm holding the microphone right now, I want to take advantage of that to ask the first question, and y'all can be thinking of your questions as Maurice and Deborah respond to it. But I want to begin not with a question, but with some gratitude, because Maurice and Deborah, I've worked with you on this chapter for a long time. And today I learned a lot more deeply about your project and your work than I'd learned up to now. And so I'm really grateful that you made the time to come here and share what you shared today, because I got a new vision of that work. And so here's my question to you. You talked a little toward the end of your presentation about some of the outcomes of doing this work. Maurice, you talked about carrying that realization you had about your own voice mattering and carrying that into the work you're doing with the high school students in Springfield, and how your goal then was to help them have a sense that their voices mattered. Um, and Deborah, you talked about the need to disrupt grind culture as part of undoing or undermining white supremacy in the culture of the academy. And I'm curious for both of you, what else might you see as outcomes of this project and this work, either in your own practice moving forward in your life and your vision for how you're going to do the work that you do, or outcomes for the community or the university? So, any of that you'd care to pick up, I'd love to hear you talk about some more.
Maurice, do you have something?
I can take a stab at it, I guess, first. So I think like some major outcomes, I think probably just like with anyone involved in the conversation series, or maybe just me personally. But like I said before, like I think conversations like that, like designated to that time, like are things that I like even still think about. Because like I said before, like with the whole sense of urgency thing and being able to like slow down and like think about perfectionism, which I think
Mm,
also is like largely related to like healing justice, are stuff that you don't talk about once, but it's stuff that kind of like lingers and festers. So I think that those whole ideas have really informed just my entire probably like junior and senior year being at UMass. And I think like the biggest direct example that I can think about is this current academic year, so like 2 semesters or the last 2 semesters, I'm in like a program because I'm a psychology and English major. I'm in a program called Advancing Diversity in Research and Practice. And to kind of get very, I guess, psychological on you, a big conversation that we talk about in that class is regarding like having diverse samples and like participants. And something that actually was an issue, I guess, that we talked about a lot is since we are at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, which is a predominantly white school, um, and some graduate students want to conduct studies that kind of cater towards a certain demographic. There's kind of a lot of uh, inability to do that because a lot of the resistance uh, in order to achieve it is that it wouldn't be complete in like a standard, I don't know, graduate time frame. And I think immediately when I heard that, it kind of like led to all this conversations, and I was just like, well, why is the time frame like more important than actually like doing what you want, and having like all these conversations that are related to um like a lot of the stuff that we talked about in the conversation series. So yeah, I think for better, the conversations like last and they make you think a lot about stuff and yeah, both
mm,
I guess civic engagement realms, but also in like whatever classes you take, or just like with conversations with people where it's just like I remember a conversation with Vanessa where she was like talking about I think her niece and having her hair like touched, um, and how that can be a microaggression and how that was a lot of stuff. So yeah, that's my long-winded answer. I think there's a lot of things that I probably could talk more about, but I don't know if you have other stuff done.
okay, great. Yeah, there will be some more questions, but Deborah, you want to give a response to the question I asked?
Sure, I guess I'd just say that like again, it's for me, I think the time thing is so present. And I think for me, really setting boundaries and realizing that the most important thing for me personally is my teaching and my students, and that like, you know, a lot of the others, I mean, aside from my family, I'm talking about like in the institution. And so how do we continue to set boundaries and say no to things that are going to interfere with being able to have those deep conversations, to be able to spend time with our students and with and being in the community. So that's what I'll say.
Okay, I'm going to pick up one of the questions in the chat that really relates to what you just said. The question is, what impact do you think grind culture has on anti-racism, and why would that be something that we need to disrupt to achieve our goal? I think you already began to answer this question, so I'll just put it out and you can carry it where you want to take it.
And I just want to quickly answer the first part of that question. Thank you for asking that. Just about how did we find, so these were existing community partners, but also because of the grant, we were able to pay people and stipends. The students and the community partners were paid stipends, and the two community partners who were on the planning team also got larger stipends, of course. So I just wanted to mention that there was some financial and structural support for bringing those folks in. But I don't know, Maurice, do you want to take that?
Oh yeah, I can take it. I don't know if you wanted to.
It doesn't matter. I can do it too, whatever you want.
Oh, okay, I'll try and be short. But I think like grind culture definitely, because I think it's just so important to just like be able to slow down a lot of the time, because like I think the best way that I can think about this is like my girlfriend right now, she is finishing, or she's like doing a senior symposium, I think at Amherst College. And then I'm like, congratulations, you like finished your like senior symposium and all this stuff. Um, and I'm like, take that in. And don't like just go straight into the next thing, but just like sit with it because it's hard. It takes a lot. But I think it would just be crazy to just essentially like finish and then immediately like run into the next thing. And I think that's basically like what grind culture is. It's like, where's the training and the like planning, where it's like, okay, like I think when you think about like running or at least for me, like I am a runner as well. So it's like when you run a 5K or something, like you want to drink your water at the end of the race and like take pictures and, you know, catch your breath. But if you just kept running to keep going, then it's like, okay, my brain is essentially dead, my body's dead. Like I don't have the time or the energy to really just like think and like conduct a more healthy approach to whatever the next thing is. So that's like my answer, but I don't know if you
Yeah,
have.
that's yes, I want to lift that up very high, Maurice, because that's all that resonates with me. I would say also that grind culture privileges people who have time for grind culture, and people who are healthy enough to survive grind culture. So we're talking about, you know, if we're talking about in the academy, we're talking about white men, people who aren't experiencing intergenerational trauma. We're talking, you know, about you know, people who don't have second jobs or are taking care of families or taking care of elders at home. And so when we think about who those populations are, grind culture only serves only rewards us and serves a certain particular demographic of the academic population. And so I think that that's one way to sort of reason or to connect grind culture to racism and white supremacy culture. And I also think that healing justice, making time for that, is actually the exact opposite of that. It's actually lifting up the people who are experiencing intergenerational trauma and trying to bring that like holistically into our spaces and understand that and make space for healing for people. And you can't have that space for healing in grind culture.
Thank you both for those responses. And I want to just take a moment to let them settle. Important, really important messages for us to carry. And so here's another question for you, Maurice, about the process of co-authoring the chapter. And the question is, what do you think you gained or learned from this process of reflecting and co-theorizing with the other authors? And maybe, what are some challenges for you as a student to engage in that process?
Yeah. I think that's a very good question. I would say I think I'm very grateful just for the process that I don't even know if it was talked about or created or if you guys like discussed how you would invite us into the co-authoring position. But basically the process was I think super collaborative like between Deborah and Linda Way. Um but basically, if you read the chapter, a lot of it is very interview style. So I think we were prompted a question and then we just kind of like answered it in our own way, and then kind of worked from there and edit it how so. And then of course, like from there, it went into like the higher up editing stuff. But like from my end, it was very I don't know if I should say low key, but it was just very nice. And especially I think like considering I guess the whole process because I think it's very nice because it's like nothing is like trying to like stump me as well or like trick me, but it's just like what was your experience like and just like reflect from that which I think makes it even more authentic and real so even like when coming to like theorizing and other stuff um I think it's just a lot of just like this is my experience and if you want to call that a theory then I guess you can but I think a lot of the stuff that Carlia and I reflected on is very similar and different in ways. And I think that kind of contributes to like the individuality of the nature of each other. And that's how we are. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we wanted just to add to that, sort of the behind the scenes process is that most of the writing happened over the summer and we wanted Maurice and Carlia to participate and we didn't want to put too much work on them. And so we were trying to together find a balance. And so Linda Way and I went back to the focus groups and generated some particular prompts that we could ask them. And then we ran those by Maurice and Carlia and we sort of edited them based on what they were interested in answering. And then we did it like a question and answer format. So their responses were just reflective. And then of course, after we kind of like got it together, send it back to them for edits and clarifications if they wanted to kind of say something different. And so it actually was, you know what, I'm just realizing now, Maurice, actually our writing was a conversation, just like the
Yeah.
creative conversation series was a conversation, really.
This is so cool. So there's one more question in the chat, and this is probably the last question we'll have time for today. It's from Will Brumette, if I said your name right, Will. And Will asks, says, I'm curious to ask you both at the end of this process, what is a question or learning that still sits with you? What parts of disrupting white supremacy and healing justice culture are still sitting with you today? And what is the one message you want other students on the call to take away? I guess I'd add to that you would want the people on the call who work with students to take to their students. Yeah.
Yeah. I
So
think
what
I can
still sits with you?
Uh, yeah, I think I can start. I think with the first part with like the curiosity thing, I think like a big part for me is I'd probably want to have another community conversation series. Um, which again, you know, is kind of like a whole time thing. And I know in the Cecil department at UMass, I think we do have some sort, but I think to like the capacity that we did our series, I don't know. But I think the big thing is just like when, again, time wise, can like community organizers and students and like faculty just sit down and talk with each other more. And I guess the other component is to that, how do we find time or even like make time or incentivize those conversations? Um, so I think that's probably like the biggest thing that I'm curious about. And I guess like the parts of disrupting white supremacy or healing justice that are still sticking with me today are the big conversation element. The fact that like we can sit on this call and like talk about this stuff and still like work with some stuff and sift through some stuff, I think is something that I'm probably taking with me. And if I was going to talk to any student who might be on the call or listening to this, I would say that you are capable of doing the work. You are not, I don't know, unqualified. You can do this pretty easily. Well, actually, it might be hard, but you're definitely capable of doing it. And I would just encourage you to try, and you never know what will happen with it. So, yeah.
What he said.
Okay. What he said. Okay. We do have time really quickly for one more question. And there are two of them linked together for you, Deborah. What exactly does horizontalism refer to? And how are you able to start a conversation about people's experiences and their individual struggles without sort of trying to take over the conversation like a lecture to imply that the person leading the conversation, like you, knows about right and wrong and about what needs to be done and how?
Yeah, so horizontalism is kind of what we were talking about when we were striving for that, seeing the folks who were leading these spaces. There were two students and two community organization reps, seeing each other as equals and really working together collaboratively and saying that each had valued life experiences. And especially since I think the group we were going to bring into the conversation included both students and community organizations. The fact that we had two students and two community folks in the planning group, they both knew and had equal experience with their populations. And so we're able to design something collaboratively in a way. So that's what I think we mean by kind of striving toward horizontalism in this space. And I want to clarify too that, so I didn't lead anything in this at all. It was led entirely, I participated, but it was led entirely by Maurice, Carlia, Vanessa, and Marissa. And you can speak to this too, Maurice, but I think they just designed it in a way that like we did a lot of that writing and brainstorming and pair shares and they designed it with all these kind of interactive components. So it was never lecture-y, but Maurice, you can speak to that too.
Yeah. And I think I was thinking about talking about it during the presentation, but like during um I think like the series and a lot of the stuff, I think you and Joseph were literally like there, but I think you had like either your Zoom camera off or like you guys would be like doing stuff behind the scenes. So it was just like even like us just being able to like not care about like what notes are being taken or whatever, but they would be in the background just like taking notes and tracking themes and doing stuff, which is very valuable. But yeah, I think that was kind of the big role that you played, and it was super valuable and almost as significant as the discussion that we had in ourselves, I think, in ways. But yeah.
Okay, I need to acknowledge that some of you may have other commitments that you need to pick up. It's now 1 minute after 4 o'clock. And I want to thank you all for coming here today. And I want to point out that Nicole has put into the chat a link to register for the next Knowledge to Action workshop, which will focus on our Section 4, compassionate and reflective classrooms on and off campus. That'll be May 16th at 3 o'clock. And we invite you to come back for conversations about how do you do this work in your own practice. And so that's what we will be getting into then. Again, thank you so much. And I'm going to say goodbye to you now.